Hi there, this video on food rights and the political economy of hunger builds on a previous discussion of food rights and an even bigger series of videos dealing with food and the environment and consumption. So here we're going to get into thinking about Amartya Sen and his theory of food rights. We've talked about food sovereignty as a competing concept in a previous video. What is food rights? And this is the idea that food is a human right, basically, just as we discussed water in the same light. Uh, People need food to survive, yet food is also a commodity. It's privatized. It's something you have to pay money for. So we have competing concepts then, food as a right versus food as a commodity. So for Sen, food is a right and a matter of entitlement. So he says starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It's not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. Right? So this is an important point. We often assume that when there's a famine, when there's starvation in a country or malnutrition, that it's a supply problem. We just don't have enough food to go around. But as Sen reminds us, that's not always the case. In fact, it's usually not the case. In fact, where we find most famines historically is in the very same place where we find net exports of agricultural production, which goes completely against intuition. You would assume that places that were starving would be devoting all of their energy to growing food to feed their domestic population. But reality is, instead, they're trying to raise money through agricultural exports, and that money then could be used to buy the food that's needed. But some of that has to do with the price of the commodities being exported being too low. And Amartya Sen provided an empirical analysis in the 1980s that provided powerful data supporting this notion that famines were not the result of acts of nature or angry gods, supply problems, but in fact economic failures. And he looked at uh, famines in Bengal, Ethiopia, Sahel countries, and Bangladesh. And though natural disasters did occur in three of these cases, the food supply was not harmed by these disasters. So the common rhetoric of the time was, this was an act of God. These shortages resulted from natural disasters, and therefore people were starving. But Sen points out that's not at all what happened. So Sen has argued that famines are the result of exchange entitlements, labor wages relative to food costs. People are not paid enough money. Agricultural work across countries tends to be the lowest paid. And that is because agricultural products tend to fetch the least amount of money compared to highly refined food products, which are the result of industrialization and manufacturing. So governments were ill prepared for famine as they were only monitoring the supply of food, not necessarily the availability of that food among the population. So, in fact, where you have famine, sometimes you have plenty of supply, but you don't have workers earning enough money to buy food domestically. And in Bangladesh, they refused a major food shipment right before the famine hit to make things even worse because their supply was adequate. So international aid is often looked to as a solution, and it may seem desirable to mobilize international aid when famines strike, but that actually can have negative consequences against, again, maybe that's not intuitive, but when you drop free food on an agricultural economy, that undercuts the ability of farmers to sell their products. And that therefore hurts the ability of that country to become more self sufficient and self reliant. So, if the goal is to build food capacity of the country and food resiliency, dumping free food on it is the worst thing you can do, even though it may solve a short term problem of feeding people. In terms of the long term, the goal should be to protect local farmers' livelihoods. And that does not mean relying on food imports or emergency aid. If we look at the case of Haiti, we can see this play out. Uh, Haiti accepted a major loan from the International Monetary Fund, and As part of the terms of that loan, they had to accept structural adjustments. That means that trade was liberalized, tariffs and protections were removed, so the Haitian government could not apply tariffs to food imports, for instance. That would give their domestic farmers an economic advantage. So, in other words, domestic farmers had to compete against global farmers. And keep in mind, many of these global farmers are being subsidized by their governments. So, they're basically being paid to produce food at a loss. And it's nearly impossible to compete against that. So, global trade can be very harmful to domestic production and capacity for farming locally at the national level. So, and that's exactly what happened. In Haiti, local farming was devastated as farmers lost their competitive advantages and revenues were lost as a result. They couldn't compete with the subsidized agriculture on the world market. And the end result was a higher level of dependency on imports and emergency aid as Haitian farmers went out of business. And so all of that could have been avoided had we avoided this trade liberalization and the elimination of tariffs and protections. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something from our discussions of food security, food sovereignty, population, and consumption. Thank you.